There's going to be an RMB pole in the East, and there will continue to be a dollar pole in the West. I have some clients who said to me, Jim, whenever the RMB starts coming into being more for banking functions and trade payment functions, don't you just think that the United States is going to shut it down, have a war with China, expand the trade war, and basically try to stop China by whatever means, murder heads of state, whatever? And I said, no, I don't think so. Not this time. China's not Brazil. China's not Ukraine. China's not Syria. China's not Yemen. China's much bigger, and China's much wealthier, and China has industry, and China has a lot of friends. So what you're going to see, I've been saying this now for about, I would guess, 8 to 10 months. What you're going to see is the United States admitting we cannot stop the RMB usage in trade payment, usage in investment, and usage in banking function, like bank reserves. Okay? We can't stop it. So we're not going to. So we're going to thumb our nose at the RMB universe. We're going to say, have at it. Go for it. Have a good time. See where it goes. Go ahead. I mean, right now the percentages are way under 10% for trade payment and way under 10% for bank reserves denominated in RMB terms. RMB standing for renminbi, the other name used for the yuan. In Chinese Mandarin, renminbi means people's money. It's kind of interesting. So the dual universe is going to be permitted. It's going to be tolerated. It's not going to be, what's the word? Tortured. It's not going to be criminally obstructed. The U.S. is just going to say, go ahead, China, see how far you get. Go ahead, China, see how many different commercial partners you can line up. Go ahead, China, start issuing more government debt in RMB and invite your friends to use it in banks. See how it competes with the dollar and the treasuries, U.S. Treasury bonds. They're going to dare the Chinese to develop it because the United States has been stopped at Ukraine and has been stopped at Syria and has been stopped in Yemen with 3, I don't want to say failures of war, but let's just say successful interruptions of war and its advancement. They've been stymied. They become regional wars when the United States is actively pursuing a global war through the Rothschild channels through bankers, governments, military, and weapons makers, the Rothschild kingdom. Okay, so what's coming is a dual universe. There's going to be the West, like Western Europe, England, North America, parts of South America, even pockets of the Middle East and Africa, and elements of Asia. They're going to continue with the dollar. They're going to continue with treasury bonds in their banking system. They're going to continue to use the dollar in trade payments. But they're going to start to use a little bit more of the RMB in trade. And they might start, converting some of those maturing U.S. treasuries and buy up some Chinese government bonds for the banks and their reserves. So you're going to have the Western world primarily, plus some satellites, using the dollar. You're going to have the Asian and the Eastern world with the BRICS nations and the emerging market nations, China teaming up with Russia at the lead, and they're going to develop the RMB universe. And they're going to develop projects to increase the flow of payments. The whole payment system is going to move toward RMB and ruble, primarily RMB. I think the Russians are very content letting the Chinese run with the RMB, and the Chinese will just support their every move. Okay, the entire BRICS development, those different projects, they will be in RMB. The Eurasian trade zone is coming into form, and it wasn't, by accident. Some people dismiss it. Well, that's not even significant. The former Soviet republics are all part of the nucleus with Russia and China in the Eurasian trade zone. And they're gathering in nations of Eastern Europe, and they're gathering in a number of nations in Southeast Asia. And they're going to continue. The big battleground I see regarding this dual universe will be Korea and Japan. Japan has made some moves just in the last 18 months that have angered Washington with respect to Russia, pipelines, and LNG gas facilities. They got some joint projects. The Koreans have built a number of different smaller connections, but basically are an occupied nation with 100,000 U.S. military soldiers on their soil. I don't even want to get into North Korea. It's a crazy, crazy story. My point is that the U.S., the government, and the bankers, which are kind of inseparable since 9/11, since they executed the 9/11 events, they're going to tolerate the Eurasian trade zone and its RMB pole. There's going to be an RMB pole in the East, and there will continue to be a dollar pole in the West. Not just will Japan and Korea be interesting to watch in Asia, it'll be interesting and exciting and dangerous and nerve-wracking to watch what happens in the Persian Gulf with Saudi Arabia. I think they're going to bend over and finally yield to the Chinese and agree to selling Saudi oil to China in RMB terms. They can't stop it. The United States is going to, how shall I say, not begin, how shall I say, accelerate its murder and terror inside Saudi Arabia. It has already begun. I'm making an open statement that the violence and killings of Saudi princes and officials has U.S. fingerprints. It's very, very messy what's going on in Saudi Arabia right now, and it has to sort out some.
Now, if you can expand a little bit on that, because there were a couple of viewers wanting to know your perspective on the Saudi Arabia saga, as one person put it, and, the arrest of princes and so on. What's happening right now with the Saudi house?
Complete chaos. Widespread opposition to the crown prince. Okay, you got to get some of these players cleaned up in your mind. Mohammed bin Salman is the son of King Salman, who's 81 and senile. Yet, this king changed the status of his son, Mohammed, to become the crown prince. Okay, the other elder prince is angry and was the favorite from the Langley group. It's extremely complicated because the Langley group wanted the oldest son in line because that son was less in favor of regional terrorism. So imagine Langley wanting somebody who was less in favor of terrorism. That's not logical and goes completely against all past history of recent years. Okay, so Mohammed bin Salman has a new nickname. It's MBS. So we had the mortgage-backed securities creating havoc 10 years ago. Now we have a new MBS creating havoc in Saudi Arabia because he's done a purge and a confiscation of wealth for all the pro-West, pro-dollar advocates. And now a helicopter has been downed with 10 elites, Saudi royals and officers, officials. And I'm trying to sort out exactly what's going on, and I don't think I'll ever know exactly what's going on. I'll just have better glimpses from time to time. But it looks like the downed helicopter were the pro-American, the pro-dollar. And the confiscated bank accounts were the pro-dollar. And this is not simple, Elijah. We really need soon to be developed a program guide for watching an Arabic tragedy play. The Saudis have no friends, except from UAE, their partners in the Yemen war. The Saudis have no friends. It's evident with their spat with Qatar about 6 months ago. And Saudi did not prevail in that. Even though the American military, U.S. military, has locations, CENTCOM location inside Qatar. The Saudis have been spreading fundamentalist type violence in Egypt, and they hate the Saudis. The Saudis have no friends except their neighbor in the UAE, and one very smart contact of mine said, don't be surprised if you see soon some missiles coming from Yemen crashing into both Saudi Arabian urban centers and Abu Dhabi. That's the chief city-state in the United Arab Emirates, UAE. UAE is where the princes live and where they keep their money. Dubai is where the commerce takes place with a lot of banking that's international. So I expect the missiles to hit Abu Dhabi, which is dirty with its hands in the Yemen war. And it was UAE who hired the Australian mercenaries to conduct the war in Yemen and to hire thousands of Sudanese for cannon fodder. Yeah, Sudan. There are Sudan soldiers in Yemen fighting with the Saudis and the UAE. There are very few UAE soldiers. There's mostly Saudi Air Force soldiers and a lot of mercenaries on the ground. You know, if you want to hire Africans from Sudan to fight a war, don't expect much progress or success. And not only that, but the Saudis enlisted the help of a stage 4 laboratory in France and used it to distribute by air cholera in Yemen. Saudi has avoided war crime charges by the United Nations only because the U.S. told the UN don't do it, and the Saudis bribed them. Okay, so the Saudis have no friends. And now they're signing contracts with Russian Rosneft to supply Russia with oil. And that has to do with the Russian Rosneft oil consortium. They're trying to create an international oil pool for sale outside the dollar and for mixture function handled by Rosneft. The Saudis don't need mixture of oil. They need money. They're running out of money. They're issuing government bonds to finance their government functions, to pay for their welfare, and to finance the war. I think they're financing the war with narcotics, and they're financing their domestic function with the bonds. The Saudis have no friends. I've said this 5 times. They're the most hated among the Arab nations right now, partly because they've been in the U.S. pocket for so long. but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And I certain things I just don't like talking about much, but, and I don't know a great deal. I just know little bits and pieces, but I don't like talking about certain elements of the Saudi makeup. They have enemies with Iran. Iran is using Yemen to undermine the Saudis by draining their finances, by making a war that's not successful, that the Saudis continue to pitch in on costs. Iran has, I believe, soldiers on the ground in Yemen. I think they've also got some mercenaries. This is going to get very weird and very ugly very fast because the Saudis have some connections with the Lebanese government. The Saudis don't want continuation of King Assad in Syria. So they fund ISIS to unseat King Assad, President Assad, whatever you want, dictator Assad, I don't care. The U.S. has dictators too, we just call them presidents. Okay, what's coming next is a more widely recognized failure of Aramco, their giant Saudi petrochemical industry, and a wider recognition that the Saudi oil reserves are largely depleted. You actually see bullshit in the press in the West saying Saudi still commands 250 billion barrels of oil. If it's a tenth of that, it would be amazing. You don't produce for 50, 60 consecutive years, leading the world in output without having some depletion. And their discoveries are small. Of course, they've got new discoveries. Got a number of them, but they're not very big. They don't offset 50 years of gigantic production. That's why they invaded Yemen, to steal their oil reserves and gas reserves. It's the dirtiest secret in the entire Middle East right now, stealing Yemen energy reserves with the help of the U.S. military. And Iran stepped in and said, no, stop that. We're not going to let that be easily done. Because if Saudi overruns Yemen, they can overrun African nations. They can overrun anybody. They can do anything they want with the U.S. military help. So Russia stops U.S. military, Iran stops the Saudi mercenaries. Okay, the other big event coming is the Saudis are going to agree for selling China oil and taking RMB in payments. And I think when that happens, you're going to see an acceleration of Langley-sponsored violence inside Saudi Arabia with assassinations and bombings of royals all over the place. There have been 2 Saudi royals killed in just the last week, and I think we're going to see dozens after they agreed to accept RMB in oil sales, because the U.S. has told them, do not accept non-dollar payment or there will be consequences. You know, it's kind of funny, really, because the Saudis must be wondering at this point, what do we have to lose except our throne? Because the U.S. and the London boys stole all our gold in the Swiss banks. The entire UBS and Credit Suisse criminal charges laid by the U.S., which, by the way, has no jurisdiction in Swiss banks, all those criminal charges were to work out a deal with the Swiss banks and their government for control of the bullion banks that the Arab world used for storing their gold. And the Swiss and the Americans divvied up the stolen gold. The Saudis managed to move some of it into Deutsche Bank, which is really another great irony because it's a huge Western bastion of banking criminality and derivative exposure. But it's apparently safe there. And now the Saudis are probably wondering how much longer do we have before our palace is overrun. I've been calling for a palace coup for a year. I've been told by even some rather respected contacts of mine that it just can't happen. you've got the Saudi military, you've got their National Guard, and you've got their clerics. And the Saudi royals have control of all three of them. And I said, well, they have control until they don't. And now we're starting to see the players get knocked off. The leader of the Saudi National Guard was a fellow named Prince Miteb bin Abdullah. Miteb bin Abdullah. He's dead. Okay? And they're just falling one by one. You know, you take out the leader of the National Guard, you took out one of the three important linchpins for holding together the Saudi royalty and the throne. I think you're going to get a battle between the oldest son, the oldest brother of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, MBS, a battle between MBS and his older brother, and a battle joined by other half-brothers. You should see the family tree. It's ridiculous. It's not vertical. It's horizontal. It's ridiculous. These guys have 20, 30 half-brothers. They all want a piece of the throne. Some of them have been locked out for 20 years. I mean locked out of oil revenue flow. I mean like billion-dollar monthly allowances. I'm talking about the top royals, not the lower-level royals. Lower-level royals have 10 million a month, not billions. Okay, so the nation has been fleeced. A lot of princes and royals are angry and ready for vengeance. Some important people are being knocked off. The Aramco oil deal is going absolutely nowhere, and Trump showed some extreme ignorance in the last week, saying, I insist that Aramco be listed in New York. Well, look, you idiot. You helped sponsor the congressional law for blaming Saudi for 9/11, confiscating and freezing their assets and permitting lawsuits to drain those assets. I don't think Saudi wants to list in New York after that. Oh my gosh, what stupidity American leaders have. I don't even think there's going to be an IPO, because an initial stock offering for Aramco would require a good deal more disclosure, analysis, and comparative valuation. And so far, all that effort has revealed that the reserves are much lower than they state, and the value is 4 to 5 times less than the $2 trillion that they claim. So I think Saudi's cooked, and I enjoy watching them go down. They're not a good nation. They've never been honorable. They've done some good things, but nothing compared to effective leaders like in Oman, Qatar, and Libya for their people. The Saudis have basically stolen their national wealth, bought properties all over the world, invested in New York banks, London banks, and left their nation critically poor. So now it's time for them to go. And the only question is whether they go with or without their heads attached. I think we're going to see some palace coup coming up. I think you're going to hear MBS, the Crown Prince, leaves the country and cannot come back. Because whenever he leaves the country next, he's going to have trouble holding on to power, because a bit of his entourage will have to go with him. Suppose he makes a trip and goes to China, or goes to Russia, or goes to, let's just even say maybe even long shot, Lebanon. I don't think he'll come back. It's going to be interesting. There's plenty of precedent for that happen. They call it, government in exile. They never made it back home. Plenty of precedents. Okay, well, any remaining questions?
Yes, there's one from Donovan Miller, and it has to do with the U.S. dollar. He's wanting to know, do you think there's any hypothetical scenario where the U.S. dollar does not disappear? Is there any way to salvage it?
In its current form, it will be salvaged, but it will not remain in use inside the United States. It will be salvaged as an international currency for some payments and transactions, some investments, and bank accounts. But when that happens, I call it the international dollar. When that happens, a couple of important things will happen at that same time. A group, perhaps led by China, will be in charge of its rules. And there will be a sunset. They'll be told, okay, you've got it. Okay, I'll give you a couple examples. Joe has a bank account in Panama worth $1 million. Joe has a bank account, no, Mike has a bank account in Singapore with $2 million. And Nancy has a bank account in Hong Kong worth $5 million. Okay, each will be told, you've got 18 months to move it out, to convert to other currencies, to convert to gold, to convert to a crypto, to convert to an RMB, or to convert to something new that's coming along with a gold backing. But you got 18 months, because when the dollar changes and the new dollar comes inside the United States for domestic usage only, I call it the new Scheist dollar. When that happens, dollars outside the United States will become international dollars, and they will hold value very well. It's the internal dollar, the new dollar, that'll be devalued because it'll be subjected to the fundamentals of the U.S., which include over $500 billion in trade deficit and about $1 trillion a year in federal deficit. Okay, the nature of the question indicates to me a lack of understanding of something. The U.S. dollar, if it has to rely on its own fundamentals, is dead. It's third world. I love giving this one example. Just focus on the trade deficit. Trump's actually talking about a new asset-backed dollar right now, and he's speaking straight out of his ass, because he's not talking about reindustrializing the nation, nor is he addressing the deficits. But the trade deficit was $550 billion last year, and I think it's bigger this year. Let's just call it $500 billion. That's 13,000 tons of gold at current prices. The trade deficit each year, without industrializing the nation, will result in a forfeiture of 13,000 tons of gold. Now, others, without doing much homework, have said, oh yeah, but we can have oil and gas backing too. All right, let's just look at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I did a calculation, and I came up with a gosh, I continue to make that mistake. I came up with a calculation of its value based on $50 oil, simple napkin math, that the U.S. official Strategic Petroleum Reserve was worth $7 billion. Okay, multiply by 70 and you get the annual trade deficit. So we would forfeit either gold or 70 different individual strategic oil reserves each year. We're not ready for an asset-backed dollar. We're ready for the third world where we belong because we shipped out our industry following the Rockefeller Foundation Council. Remember the low-cost solution? You're too young for this, Elijah, but in the 1980s, they called it the low-cost solution. Let's ship out American industry. Let's send it to Mexico, enjoy a third the cost. Let's send out the chip fabrication plants and move it to the Pacific Rim where it's about a third the cost. And we'll enjoy tremendous prosperity in the United States from lower cost manufacturing because we'll own all that intellectual property. Right. What happened was far from that reality. What happened was the United States became dependent on financial bubbles, asset bubbles, housing, stocks. Have we fixed anything since the Lehman Brothers, or have we repeated it on a totally Western scale? The answer is totally Western scale. Okay, so we've lost, this is, think of Dr. Jim, the young statistical analyst, reading the Wall Street Journal in the 1980s. Oh my gosh, I said to my friend, we're losing our legitimate industrial income. We're going to be relying on financial engineering and bullshit. I said, this is going to end very badly in 20 years. And 20 years we had Lehman. 30 years we have something bigger than Lehman. The death of the petrodollar is starting right now. No, the dollar in its current form cannot survive. No. It requires an adaptation for domestic usage inside the United States in order to satisfy a very important function, and that is import supply. Because the rest of the world is not going to want more treasuries when they're getting rid of them in their banking system and they don't use them to buy oil. It's those two big functions, banking functions and trade payment. The dollar is not going to be the lead dog anymore for either. They might still be the lead dog in trade payment, but it's going to be just with our friends, Western Europe, Canada, US, parts of South America and UK, England. I think it's going to be an exciting time with the fall of Saudi and their kingdom, with the rise of the dual universe, because it will force the United States to launch its own currency, which China demands and requires. 2 years ago, the Chinese said, you need a new dollar, you need to devalue it 50%. That'll bring back industry for investment, but it'll also bring back in line the true value of your currency given your wretched fundamentals, the deficits. And the United States replied, oh yeah? Well, we think we're going to invade Ukraine. We're going to screw up the world balance. We think we're going to invade Syria. We're going to screw up that balance too. We're going to just destabilize everything. How do you like that, China? This is what the United States is all about: destabilizing, stealing, defrauding, and killing civilians in war crimes. So it's moving toward a new level where the United States is going to have some challenges to bring in imports. And notice a big jump in port traffic. I asked The Voice, I asked my team, colleagues, why do you suppose there's a jump in port traffic into the United States? And The Voice said, because there's a lot of concern over the bankruptcy of both shippers and the bankruptcy of companies that are doing import business with the United States. In other words, discontinued import supply with trouble on the shipping side. Okay, so yeah, the dollar will survive, but not inside the U.S. It's going to become an international currency. And I'm looking forward to that, because it means the people, the group, the board making the rules for the international dollar will change, and they will no longer be Washington. Washington is making rules for the whole world right now and charging crimes like against the Swiss banks. My gosh, it was really quite funny what they did at UBS and Credit Suisse. Isn't that what happened? The same thing with French banks? Isn't the same thing that happened with German banks? Isn't that the same thing that happened with British banks? Isn't that the same thing that happened with Saudi banks? Isn't that the same thing that happened with Taiwanese banks? No, you don't understand. It's the Swiss banks that the Saudis had their gold stored in. Okay, the gullibility of Americans when they read the nonsensical press it's really funny. It's funny where we put into practice the principles of Goebbels, uh, and we just keep lying. We repeat the lies, and Goebbels said, if just keep the lies coming and keep repeating them, and public will believe them. He also said, make sure they're big lies. So keep repeating them and make them big lies, and public will accept them. The U.S. public is very unimpressive. I like the fringe. I like that 10% that has a brain and uses it and listens to shows like this and signs up for newsletters like the Hat Trick Letter. I admire these people. These people, they endure difficulties in their own families and group of friends. And I admire them. They're the brave souls. They're the patriots. It's not the people who read the New York Times and criticize their neighbors for thinking there's something wrong with American politics and finance. Oh, boy. All right. Well, look, I got to get going here. It's great being on, Elijah. We covered a lot of ground.
Definitely. Well, Jim Willie, thank you so much for joining us today. I guess before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and where people can find you online?
I don't have any last thoughts. I rambled quite a bit. The newsletter has been 13 and a half years now. It's it's a labor of love, but it's also a labor with not a great deal of satisfaction with respect to the gold price. But I urge people, just hang on. Gold and silver are going to be just about the only surviving assets when the dollar goes down. I mean the petrodollar. I don't mean the international dollar. I don't mean the actual Forex unit. When the dollar system fails, gold and silver are going to be standing and thriving. But anyway, and we're just months away from more successes and some pretty solid encouragement, I believe. But www.goldenjackass.com is the website. 13 and a half years. This month is month number 164. I look on my calendar. As I flip a calendar, I put the next number on it. That way I don't make mistakes. Don't have to verify. But there are two reports that are central to the newsletter. It's the Global Money War Report and the Golden Currency Report. They're a little bit different. They overlap sometimes in topics and themes. Hard not to. Things are quite interwoven. But the Global Money War Report is basically about sustaining the king dollar and defending it and all the various bank frauds and derivative machinations to keep things going. The gold and currency report is more about the emerging Eurasian trade zone, China, petroleum, Russia, actual gold and silver demand, gold and silver deficits, demand per nation, different rules from the different countries regarding ownership of gold and silver, and just the whole development of the Eurasian trade zone and the rising gold structures to oppose the dollar. It's fun. It's interesting. I do miss my statistical analysis, and I've been doing something. This is a very quick aside to close out. I've been doing something for the last 3 years that just keeps me entertained and sharp. I have a collection of solved math problems. I just take on a new math problem once in a while. I put my head to the stone and solve it, and sometimes I get a little help. Most of the time I don't. So I keep sharp with my math just as a hobby. I read my math and statistics books during downtime. I mean, imagine trying to relax reading Greek, huh? But that's what I do, and I'm still sharp with my statistics and my math. And right now I have to be sharp with forensic criminal analysis, which is basically the core of the Hat Trick Letter. How is this going to evolve? I don't know exactly. I've got a rough idea, a rough framework of how this is going to play out and how it's going to look in the next few years. And I do not believe we're going to see any wider war. Do not believe it at all. So, just ignore all the scare merchants. Much bigger threat than nuclear war is global breakout of viruses from the US and European pharmaceutical companies. They're putting them into vaccines. They're putting viruses in vaccines. I'm much more concerned about that than I am nuclear war.
Well, Dr. Jim Willie, once again, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, it's a pleasure having me on. Thanks. Bye now.